We're learning the second Sikha of Parshas Masei in Chelek Yudches on page 399. This Sikha is a siyum on Masech Ksubis. In the last section of Masech Ksubis, the Gemara speaks about Eretz Yisrael, the halachas of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and so on. And this is connected to this week's Parsha, as the Rebbe quotes over here, the Pasuk V'hoirashtem es haaretz. And specifically, the Rebbe will discuss the opinion of the Rambam on this matter, and additionally, how this applies also to Bavel. In the time of Galus, when Yidden are in Bavel, where the Gemara tells us not to leave Bavel. Okay, the Shir today is being learnt, Lili Nishmas, Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin, ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. Oifem Pasik, v'hoirashtem es haaretz, v'yishaftem ba. You should drive out the nations of the land, and you should settle it. Ki lechem nesati es haaretz l'reshes oisa. I gave you the land to inherit it. Zok the Ramban says as follows. Al daiti, in my opinion, zu mitzvah sasei hi. This is a mitzvah sasei, this is a positive commandment to settle Eretz Yisrael. Yitzava isam sheyeshu ba'aretz. The Eibush is commanding Yidden to live in Eretz Yisrael. V'yarshu isa, they should inherit the land. Kihu nasna lem, because Hashem gave it to us as a gift. This that we find, that our sages spoke very highly about living in Eretz Yisrael, and also that you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Right over here, it's this pasuk that we are commanded for this mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. Nachmer, we find even more so regarding the Ramban's opinion in Zayna Asagas Vashlama to Sefer HaMitzvos Lo HaRambam. The Rambam wrote a Sefer HaMitzvos where he counts all 613 mitzvahs, and the Ramban very often, or every so often, argues with the Rambam regarding what those mitzvahs are, and he takes out some, replaces with others. Rechentes the Ramban arayin in minyan mitzvahs. So there, the Ramban points out that this is one of the 613 mitzvahs, al tzabazundere mitzvah. This is a separate mitzvah. Nit v'shittas Rambam. Unlike the Rambam that does not count this settling Eretz Yisrael, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, as one of the 613 mitzvahs. And in fact, I believe most Rishonim disagree with the Ramban that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is one of the mitzvahs. Und is meidich in dem and sagt, the Ramban speaks about this at length, and he says, as das is the tam, was the Gemara sagt, that this is the basis, what the Gemara in Ksubis tells us, anyone that leaves Eretz Yisrael and lives outside Eretz Yisrael, he should be in your eyes like an individual that goes to serve idols. Shenamar, as we learn from the pasuk, David HaMelech is saying regarding Shaul that's rejecting him and sending him away, that I've been expelled today from sharing in the inheritance of Hashem, and referring to Eretz Yisrael. So a Yid that is expelled from Eretz Yisrael, or leaves Eretz Yisrael rather, is someone that's dropping Hashem's inheritance, and therefore he's serving Avodah Zarah. This is the Ramban's opinion. So now the Rambam does not, as we pointed out, does not count settling Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Doesn't mention at all that this is a mitzvah. Von deswegen, nevertheless, gefindt men in Rambam kama halachas in dem Issa reisingen von Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. We find in the Rambam, in Hilchas Melachim, many halachas that he says about not leaving Eretz Yisrael, going to Chutz La'aretz, going outside of Eretz Yisrael. Und zwischen sie, euch der halacha, amongst them, there's the following halacha. La'olam yader adam be'Eretz Yisrael. A person should always live in Eretz Yisrael, afilu be'ir sheru ba'akom, even if it's in a city that's mostly non-Jews. And should not live outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that's mostly Yidden. One that leaves Eretz Yisrael, like he's serving idols. Shenema, as the pasuk says, that I've been expelled from Eretz Yisrael, and it's like I'm serving idols. So he also quotes the same Gemara, even though he doesn't agree to the Ramban that this is based on a mitzvah sasei, but nevertheless, the advantage of living in Eretz Yisrael is so powerful that if you leave Eretz Yisrael and live outside Eretz Yisrael, it's compared to someone that's serving Avodah Zarah. Zu verstehen Shittas Rambam, so to further understand the opinion of the Rambam about the importance of not leaving Eretz Yisrael, and what is this based on? What exactly is it about the quality of the land of Eretz Yisrael that's the reason why one should live in Eretz Yisrael? Darf man verfriehen mevaya sein dem Hemshech v'siyim divrei Rambam in dem Oben dem Manta Halacha. So let's first explain the continuation of the Rambam and what he says in the conclusion of the halacha that we just mentioned. So the Rambam there says as follows: just like there's an issur not to leave Eretz Yisrael for Chutz La'aretz, kach Oster lotzis mi Bavel l'shar ha'aretz. So too in the time of Golus, when Yidden are in Bavel, they're not allowed to leave Bavel to go to other lands. Shenemar, and we learn this from the pasuk where it says Bavel yuvo, that the Yidden are brought in the exile to Bavel and V'shama Yiyu, and they should remain there. So we understand from this pasuk that the pasuk is telling you that you should remain there. So you're not allowed to leave Bavel to other lands. The makif from that halacha is, so the source of this halacha that the Rambam says here is with the Kesef Mishnah is Metzayin, as the Kesef Mishnah points out in Masechta Ksubis, also in the end of Masechta Ksubis, where the Gemara brings zwei members from Rabbi Yehuda. There it brings two statements of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Kol ha'ilami Bavel Eretz Yisrael, one that goes up from Bavel back to Eretz Yisrael, oive be'aseh. So he's transgressing on a mitzvah saseh. Not literally a mitzvah saseh, but he's going against what it says there in the pasuk, Shenemar Bavela yuvo v'shama yiu ad yoyim pakti yisam, that you should go to Bavel and remain there till it'll come the day that Hashem says, I'll remember you and redeem you and bring you back to Eretz Yisrael. Und nachdem wird dort gebracht. And then it says there another statement Rabbi Yehuda said, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kishem she'asa lotzis me'eretz Yisrael mi leBavel, just like one is not allowed in the time when Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to leave from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, kach aser lotzis mi Bavel l'shar ha'aretz. So too in the time of Golus, when Yidden are in Bavel, they're not allowed to leave from Bavel to go to any other lands outside of Bavel. Those are the two statements of Rabbi Yehuda. So in the Gemara here we see that it's actually divided into two different statements. One is about not being allowed to return, to go back from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and the other is about not leaving Bavel for any other countries. So now going back to the way the Rambam puts this, so we have the following questions that the Mefarshim ask. Aleph, number one, wie is the Rambam kailel beide members from Gemara zusammen? If you pay attention to what the Rambam says, he's combining both of these statements together. The Raya from pasuk Bavel v'Gaimer, the proof of the pasuk that Yidden went down to Bavel, brengt doch Rabbi Yehuda in the Erste Memre, that's only quoted in the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda, legabe de misi yitzia from Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, only in regards to this, that one should not return to Eretz Yisrael. Not speaking about in general leaving Bavel to any other lands. Und der Rambam brengt es beim isi yitzia from Bavel l'shar ha'aretz. And the Rambam quotes this pasuk when he is quoting the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda, was das is the zweite Meme from Rabbi Yehuda, when the Rambam says that one should not leave Bavel for any other lands, and he says the source is the pasuk of Bavel Yuvav V'Sham Yiu, which is only quoted in the Gemara regarding a Yid returning from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. So levize vert kashe mimonavshach. So therefore, it's difficult to understand. How does the Rambam understand these two statements in the Gemara? And either way you look at it, it's difficult to understand. If when the Rambam says that one may not leave Bavel to any other lands, meint der Rambam koil sein euch Eretz Yisrael. So shar ha'aratzos includes also not to leave, to go back up to Eretz Yisrael, wie the Kesef Mishnah sagt. And that's how the Kesef Mishnah understands the Rambam. That the Rambam puts it all together. Not to leave Bavel to any other lands, and also including Eretz Yisrael. Because the Rambam understands when it says in the pasuk Bavel Yuvo that the Yidden are being brought to Bavel and they should remain there. So that's telling us not only that they shouldn't return to Eretz Yisrael, but Bechlal, that they shouldn't go into any other lands. If so, going back to the Gemara is not move on, so it's not understood. Was is the Oreiftu in Gemara from the zweite Memre from Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Shmuel? So then, what is the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel adding? Was asked Lotzeis l'shar ha'aretz, that he says that you're not allowed to go to any other lands. Oif dem erste Memre from Rabbi Yehuda b'stam, more than what's already said in the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Was leret areis the is Lotzeis bibavel Eretz Yisrael from pasuk Bavela. In the first statement, he already said that you shouldn't leave from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael based on this pasuk of Bavela. Vibalt as mashma sakasav is kailo sai Eretz Yisrael and sai shar ha'aretz. According to the Rambam, apparently this pasuk of Bavela Yuvo teaches me that you're not allowed to leave Bavel not for going back to Eretz Yisrael and not to go to any other countries. So if that's already understood from this pasuk Bavela Yuvo, which is quoted in the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda, So what is the second statement of Rav Yehuda Mashmuel adding when he says that you shouldn't go to Shara Aratzis? I already know that from the first statement. So that's, if the Rambam is combining these 2 points together, that other lands in Eretz Yisrael is the same point, you may not leave Bavel to any of these places, so then why in the Gemara is it divided as 2 separate statements? In the Erste member the Rabbi Yehuda, and if we'll say that this what we learned from the pasuk Bavela in the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda is Memayit nar de aliyah from Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, it's only saying that one should not go up from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Unit yitzil l'shara ratzis, and it's not referring to leaving Bavel for any other countries. Und die zweite membre, and then in the second statement, was tutoyv the isolatis mi Bavel l'shara ratzis, and here it's adding that not only are you not allowed to return to Eretz Yisrael, but you shouldn't leave to other countries. And make nar shara ratzis in Eretz Yisrael. And here this is a second statement, and it's referring only to going to other countries and not about going back to Eretz Yisrael. And this is not learned from the pasuk Bavel Yuvo. It's a separate thing. Hotach the Rambam gedaft zogin. So then the Rambam should say it in the way we understand it from the Gemara. Either you should say the lashon from Erste member the Rabbi Yehuda, or he should be quoting the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda, which is Kach Asa Lotzes mi Bavel Eretz Yisrael, that you're not allowed to return from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and that's based on the pasuk of Bavel Yuvo. Other vibalta zok l'shara ratzis wie the zweite membre, or since the Rambam does mention that he's speaking about not leaving Bavel for other lands, like it is in the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda, hat nit gedacht bringen dem limud from pasuk Bavel v'gaimer. So then, in the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda, he does not mention the pasuk of Bavel Yuvo. The fact that you shouldn't leave Bavel to other countries is a separate point, and it's nothing to do with this pasuk. So why is the Rambam, when he speaks about leaving Bavel for other countries, base it on this pasuk of Bavel Yuvo, which in the Gemara is only quoted for leaving Bavel to Eretz Yisrael? That's the question there. Beis, another point is, forget about the fact that the Rambam is sort of combining 2 opposites that the Gemara says, but in this statement itself that the Rambam says is l'chayda astira in divrei Rambam gufa. Seemingly, this statement, the way the Rambam puts it, is contradicting itself. Von Aschalas Adin, when the Rambam begins, what does he say? Kishem she'asa lotzeis meharetz l'chutz laretz. Kach asa lotzeis mibav v'chulu. Just as one may not leave Eretz Yisrael for chutz laretz, so too, for the same reason, in the same way, you shouldn't leave Bavel for any other lands. Is mashma, so it seems as the isi yitzia mi Bavel is mitzad asvara. So it seems like that it's a comparison that we're making, that because our Yidden being in Bavel is similar to the time when Yidden were in Eretz Yisrael, so therefore the same Isra applies of not leaving. It's the same basis, the same reason of why you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. But then the Rambam concludes this by saying Shenema Bavel Yuvo, that we learned it from the pasuk Bavel Yuvo, that Yidden are brought and that they're intended to be in Bavel. Das heißt, and what this indicates is, as the Isser is nit mitzad asvara kisheim kach. The Isser of leaving Bavel is not because Bavel is compared to Eretz Yisrael. No mitzad dem pasuk. Was hat net kein Scheichtes zu the Yitziyim Eretz Yisrael l'chutz laretz. But rather it's based on this pasuk that Bavel, that they were brought to Bavel, and Hashem intended the Yidden in the time of Golus to remain in Bavel, and that has nothing to do with the Isser of leaving Eretz Yisrael. So why does the Rambam begin with equating the leaving of Bavel to leaving Eretz Yisrael, and then finish off with the pasuk of Bavel Yuval, which is unrelated to the Isra of leaving Eretz Yisrael? Gimel be'etzem inyan. Regarding this Isra of leaving Bavel, the pasuk that the Rambam brings Bavel Yuval. So we have to understand as follows. Wie bringt the Rambam from Bavel Yuval? How could the Rambam quote this pasuk of Bavel Yuval? Araya, as Yidden Taranit Arezgin from Bavel L'Shara Aratzis, that Yidden may not leave Bavel for any other countries. Be'ez the pasuk Retgar wegen the Klisharetz. When you look at that pasuk Bavel Yuval, that it's going to be brought to Bavel. What's being brought to Bavel? It's the Klisharetz. It's the holy Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash that are being brought to Bavel. Und wie es ist Muchach euch von Gemara, the Gemara itself points this out. Was the Rebbe bringt Rabbi Yehuda at zweiten pasuk. The Gemara says this pasuk Bavel Yuval cannot be used to learn from it that you shouldn't leave Bavel, and therefore the Gemara there brings another pasuk. But the Rambam quotes this pasuk Bavel Yuval. Why does he quote this pasuk, even though the Gemara itself refutes it and says that pasuk is speaking about the Klisharis? Euch darfen verstehen, kame de Yukim in Lashon Rambam, was is Meshane von Lashon Gemara. Also, if we pay attention to the exact words that Rambam uses here, there are some differences from the way it's said in the Gemara and the way the Rambam quotes this. Aleph number 1 in Gemara is the Lashon Kishem Sha'asa Lotzeis Me'eretz Yisrael, that one may not leave Eretz Yisrael. On the Rambam Shreit Mei Ha'aretz, that one may not leave Aretz, the land. So it may seem like a very small difference, but there's a difference here. And the Rabbi adds even more. So you may say that Rambam just wanted to be more concise, so he just says Mei Ha'aretz, and everybody knows we're speaking about Eretz Yisrael. Because in this halacha, and the same in all previous halachas when the Rambam discusses this, when the Rambam speaks about Eretz Yisrael, he always says Eretz Yisrael. So why suddenly here, when he speaks about not leaving Bavel, similar to not leaving Eretz Yisrael, does he say Mei Ha'aretz and not Eretz Yisrael, like it says in the Gemara? Beis, another question here is, in Gemara state, Kishem Sha'asa Lotzeis Me Eretz Yisrael LeBavel. Just like one may not leave Eretz Yisrael to go specifically to Bavel. On Lashon Rambam is Mei Ha'aretz L'chutza La'aretz. One may not leave Eretz Yisrael to outside, anywhere outside Eretz Yisrael, not specifically Bavel. Gimel, the Gemara bringt euch dem Hemshech vom Pasuk. The Gemara quotes the continuation of this pasuk. Bavel Yuval, Yidden are being brought to Bavel, V'shama Yu ad Yoim Pakti Yisam Num Hashem. Till Hashem says, the day that I will come and remember you and redeem you. And the Rambam bringt nor Aschalas HaKasav. The Rambam is only quoting the beginning of the pasuk, Bavel Yuval V'shama Yu, that Yidden are brought to Bavel to be there. Why does the Rambam not quote the full pasuk as the Gemara says? That's seemingly part of where we understand this, that until, when Hashem says, till when it will come the time for you to leave exile, you may not leave Bavel to go back to Eretz Yisrael or to go to any other place. So we have many questions here in understanding how does the Rambam explain this concept of Yidden not leaving Bavel in the time of Galus to any other places and comparing it to Eretz Yisrael. What is the opinion of the Rambam about this matter? The explanation of all of this is as follows. In dem Tam von Isse Yitzia, mi Bavel, the Shara Rotzes, gefindt men zwei Deis. So let's first begin with the Isse here to leave Bavel to any other land. So there are two opinions. What's the reason for this? So the Rambam, as we have just quoted, so the Rambam bringt of them the pasuk Bavel Yuval. The Rambam quotes this pasuk of Bavel Yuval, that this is the source of the Isser not to leave Bavel, not only back to Eretz Yisrael, but Bechlal, not to leave Bavel to any other lands. On Rashi sagt, however, Rashi says Lefi sheyesham yeshivas hamarbitzis Torah tamid, because Bavel is a place where you have the yeshivas where they're teaching Torah, and therefore if you're going to be in Bavel, you'll be able to learn Torah, you'll be able to ask a question in halacha. If you have a question, you'll go to a different place where there's no Torah. You can't live in such a place. That's the reason. So the nafke minutes vision is, so the practical difference between the Rambam that bases it on the pasuk and Rashi, which gives this reason of the yeshivas that are there. Loitas Rashi is the isi yitzil chal nor kozman says an enda yeshivas in Bavel. According to Rashi, so the issur of leaving Bavel is only in a time period when the yeshivas are there in Bavel. That's the whole reason. But then when the yeshivas are not existent in Bavel anymore, so you're allowed to leave Bavel. In contrast to Rambam's opinion, as das is mitzad the pasuk Bavel Yuvo, it's based on this that the pasuk says that Hashem says, I bring the Yidden to Bavel, is mashma as the Isser is da alamal. It would seem that this Isser applies always, that Yidden that are in Bavel should not be leaving Bavel. However, the question over here is, now we have to further clarify this, that the Rambam bases this on the pasuk. Der pasuk retoch wegen dem Zman von Galus Rishon. The pasuk is actually only speaking about the first exile, when Yidden were exiled to Bavel. Was damals the Yidden vertrieben geworden in Galus Bavel. That's where they were expelled from Eretz Yisrael. They were taken into Bavel. Aber der Galus bechorben Beis Hamikdash Hasheni is doch nicht gewesen leBavel. But when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, so the Chorben and the Galus were not exiled to Bavel. Is favos soll der Isse Bavel Yuval sein euch bei dem Galus was is Galus Edom. The Romans were the ones that destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, and the Yidden were exiled into Galus Edom, not to Bavel. So why does this apply to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash and the Galus that we're in now as well? Tosfos, which asks this question, and fit of them, he gives the following answer: Yeshloima de begalus sheni nami kapit kra. Even though the pasuk is actually speaking about the time of the first galus, but nevertheless we can learn from here that the pasuk is particular about the second galus as well, that the Yidden should remain in Bavel. That's what Tosfos says. He doesn't give any further clarification. Aber das Gufe fordert Bier, so this has to be explained. L'chayre, von wann is die Achache, als eich begal is sheni, Chotsher is nit bavela, nami kapet kra. So how can we learn it from this pasuk if, in fact, the Yidden were not exiled to Bavel in the second destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? So how do we know that the pasuk is being particular about the second Galus as well? Nachmer is nit move on. The question goes even further. Leiten Pirish from Kesef Mishnah, as we quoted before, the Kesef Mishnah says, as mitten isse lotzis mi Bavel l'shara aratzis, when it says, when the Rambam says that you shouldn't be leaving from Bavel to any other lands, meint the Rambam oyech Eretz Yisrael. This includes Eretz Yisrael. But the question is, megefintach as kama Amiraim haben oile gewen mi Bavel Eretz Yisrael. We find in that time period when the Amiraim were living in Bavel, so many Amiraim some Amiraim did leave Bavel and went back to Eretz Yisrael. Biz as Rabbi Shal Rav Yehuda, Bala Memre. Rav Yehuda himself, which is the one that said the statement that you may not leave Bavel for any other territories, including Eretz Yisrael. And who are his teachers? Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel, his two teachers, haben früher gelernt in Bavel. They originally learned in Bavel. Von dort early given in Eretz Yisrael. Then they left and went back to Eretz Yisrael. Und später sich zurückgekehrt in Bavel, and then they returned to Bavel. Was l'chayra, pikalanal, based on what we're learning here, haben sie früher nicht getart eile sein von Bavel in Eretz Yisrael. How are they allowed to leave Bavel to go back to Eretz Yisrael? Und danach nicht getart yoytze sein von Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. And then once they're in Eretz Yisrael, they're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael for Bavel. When you're in Eretz Yisrael, there's an issa to leave Eretz Yisrael, but when you're in Bavel, so then you're not allowed to leave Bavel, period. The Eibishter wants Yidden to be exiled and remain, the ones that are in Bavel to remain in Bavel. So how could Rav Yehuda say something when we clearly see that both of his teachers disagree with this? This is schwer zu sagen. Now it's very difficult to say, as the Alavas haben Eulig werden Eretz Yisrael, that all those that we find that did leave to Eretz Yisrael, ubefrat Rav and Shmuel, and specifically Rav and Shmuel, halten it with Rav Yehuda. Maybe they disagree with what Rav Yehuda said. See, with Rav Yehuda am Shmuel, or they disagree to the statement that Rav Yehuda himself quoted in the name of Shmuel, but Shmuel himself didn't behave this way. So it's very difficult to say this. I mean, the Rabbi here brings into Ha'ara that we do find it clearly in the Gemara, a discussion of Zayda. The Gemara there says, disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda. But to say that Rabbi Yehuda's own two teachers disagreed with him, that's very difficult. And also, if it's true that we see from the way the other Amiram behaved that they did go to Eretz Yisrael, as Afa Pikain, Paskin to Rambam, and the Rambam should still follow Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Kishem Shasa Lotzis Maras L'chutzlar, as Kachas Lotzis Mi Bavel, L'shara Lotzis, and the Rambam quotes that you may not leave Bavel. So how could the Rambam quote this if we find that other Amiram did leave Bavel? Kodes Abir Bazet. So this leads us to a deeper understanding of what it is, this Isser, to leave Bavel. I mean, if we look just at the simple pshat of the pasuk, that Bavela Yuval is speaking about Klisharis, Bavela Yuval is speaking about the time of the first Galus, it doesn't add up to explain why there's an Isser to leave from Bavel. So there must be some deeper understanding over here, what exactly is the Isser of leaving Bavel. So to explain this, the Rebbe first goes back to the Isser of leaving Eretz Yisrael. Because the Gemara and the Rambam equates the two, the Kishem. Just like you may not leave Eretz Yisrael, you may not leave Bavel. So let's understand better what is the Isser of leaving Eretz Yisrael. And then, was Eretz Yisrael is ausgeteilt von aller Ratzais. In this, that Eretz Yisrael is different from all other lands. Zenen Bechlal dort zwei inyanim. So generally speaking, there are 2 points here. Aleph number 1, das was der Medrash sagt. The Medrash tells us in a few places, Chaviva Eretz Yisrael, Shabacha ba Kadosh Baruch Hu. Land of Eretz Yisrael is a beloved place for Hashem. Hashem chose it as His. So it's a choice that Hashem chooses this land. Based, then there's another point. Das was Eretz Yisrael is an Eretz Kedosha. The fact that Eretz Yisrael has a certain level of holiness in it. Wir sagt in Mechilte, also in the Mechilte it tells us, as Atshele nivchara Eretz Yisrael, before Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael, hoyakala aratzais ksheires l'dibreis. All other lands were fit for Hashem to speak there. To speak to the Nevi'im, to speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, and so on. Eretz Yisrael, once Eretz Yisrael is chosen, so then Yatzu Kol HaAratzos. So then all other lands are excluded, and Hashem only reveals Himself and communicates to the Nevi'im in Eretz Yisrael. So this does not refer to this that Hashem just simply chose Eretz Yisrael as His land, but rather the fact that Hashem chooses to reveal and express and communicate to the Yidden only in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore this is a certain holiness that this place has, and therefore the Shekhinah dwells only in Eretz Yisrael, or Hashem reveals Himself only in Eretz Yisrael. Und in die zwei Inyanim besteht die Sheiches von Yidden mit Eretz Yisrael. So just like this is true regarding the actual land itself, so too there are two aspects in the Yidden's connection to the land. Aleph, number one, mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because this is the place that Hashem chose, so the Medrash tells us, Kamayim Razal, Bacha B'Eretz Yisrael. Hashem chose the land. Ubachar lechelka Yisrael. And then Hashem chose as his portion the Yidden. They are his nation. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Yevoyu Yisrael Shabal lechelki, let the Yidden that came to be mine, to be my portion, v'yinchulu es ha'aretz Shabal lechelki. And they should inherit the land that I have chosen as my portion as well. So this is one connection Yidden have to Eretz Yisrael because of Hashem's bechira, that Hashem chose the land and Hashem chose Yidden as his nation. But then the second point, Misat Kedusha. There is a holiness, was is da in Baden, that there is both in the land and in Yidden. In Eretz Yisrael, on in the Yidden. V'zeizen anam Kadosh, the Yidden are a holy nation, and therefore the holy nation of the Yidden belong to be, and they have a special connection to the holy land of Eretz Yisrael. Der Unterschied zwischen die zwei Inyanim. So what is really the distinction between these 2 points here of Hashem choosing the land and the special holiness of Hashem's presence that there is in the land? Direkt zechais zwischen andere. So this is expressed amongst other things in dem Namen von der Land, in the way we refer to the land itself. Mitzad kedusha, because of the holiness that there is in the land, wird sie angerufen Eretz Yisrael dafke, because there's a holiness that's experienced and felt in this place, that's revealed in this place. So therefore, the land is referred to as Eretz Yisrael. It's the land of the Yidden. Shailul Eretz Canaan v'chayetze b'zeh, negating any other name, Eretz Canaan, the land belonging to Canaan, or anything similar. Varim de kedusha hat nit ken shayches l'Eretz Canaan. This holiness that there is, that Hashem communicates with Yidden there, and the special kedusha, the presence of Hashem, has no connection to Canaan, to the Goyim that are there. Dakegin, by contrast, mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Eretz Yisrael, this, that Hashem chose this as his land, muzin et angerufen werden dafke Eretz Yisrael. It's not only referred to because of this as Eretz Yisrael. Mekanir anrufen euch Eretz Canaan. It could also be referred to as Eretz Canaan, v'chayetze b'zeh, and this still includes the fact that Hashem chooses Eretz Canaan. Varum, die Bechire von der Eibishter, this that Hashem chooses the land as his, is given k'shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu ha'olam, when Hashem creates the world, chalaka ha'aratzis l'shara umais, so he distributed and gave other nations their territories, ubacha b'Eretz Yisrael, and he chooses Eretz Yisrael to be his. So this is at the time of creation when there were no Yidden that were there in Eretz Yisrael, and it still then eventually becomes Eretz Canaan, but it doesn't matter who's there in the land, it doesn't matter if there's an open connection of the holiness of the Yidden to the land, Hashem still chooses the land to be his. Okay, towards the end of the Sikha, this will be explained on a much deeper level, the difference between the Bechira and the Kedusha of the land. Leitem kumtais, so now according to this it comes out, as euch in dem Isser Yitziyah von Eretz Yisrael, sind da zwei Inyanim. When it comes to this, that it's forbidden to leave the land, there are also these 2 points here. Aleph, mitzad, Kedusha Sa'aretz. One may not leave Eretz Yisrael because this is a special holy land where a Yid belongs. But das is echt negei lekiyam mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz, and this is also relevant to the mitzvahs that are dependent on Eretz Yisrael, that are only fulfilled in Eretz Yisrael. That a Yid may not leave Eretz Yisrael because then he'll be leaving the opportunity to fulfill those mitzvahs that are only in Eretz Yisrael. That's one point. Beis, another point is mitzad der bechira von Eibishter in Eretz Yisrael, was es abgegeben Yidden. Because Hashem chose this land and he gave it as a gift to Yidden, so whether there's Kedusha there or not, the very choice of Hashem that he gives this to Yidden as their gift, the Yidden may not leave Eretz Yisrael. 2 different things. So now based on this, coming back from here, from the Isra of leaving Eretz Yisrael, and connecting this also to Bavel. Then move on, Divrei Rambam. Based on this we can understand what the Rambam says, Kshem, She'asa Lotzes Mea Oretz, that we learn out one from the other. Just like one may not leave Eretz Yisrael, and the Rambam actually says, Mei ha'aretz, as the Rebbe will explain, so too you may not leave Bavel. Der Isi Yitziyah was verbunden mit Kedushas HaMokem, mitzad Kedushasa. The Isser to leave Eretz Yisrael because of the holiness of the place is Shayich Nar by Eretz Yisrael. That is only for Eretz Yisrael, the land where you have the Yidden there and you have the holiness of the place revealed and expressed. That's not to any other place in the world. The Issi Yitzia was Ko Mitzadem was the Rebishter hat the Makim Beiche gewen als Weinort for Yidden. However, this that Hashem chooses this land as a place that's designated for Yidden to live there, in dem gleicht sich aus in a bestimmte Zeit Bavel mit Eretz Yisrael. Regarding this, there is a comparison to Bavel in a certain time period, that Bavel is also chosen similar to Eretz Yisrael that was chosen for Yidden. Kishem wie der Rebishter hat Beiche gewen. Eretz Yisrael for Yidden, for them art, from Shleimus, Acheres, Vagula, from Galus, Mitzrayim. Just like Hashem chooses Eretz Yisrael to be the place where the Yidden are going to arrive at and they're going to settle in Eretz Yisrael. And this is considered to be the ultimate completion of the redemption of Mitzrayim. As it says, Vaitzeisi, Vitzalti, Vigalte, and ultimately, Vehivesi, the Abish is going to bring Yidden to Eretz Yisrael. So this is the place where Hashem chooses for Yidden to permanently settle. Und danach, so then, following the years later as well, Fashanim Kitikunam, in the time period in the years when Yidden are in the place where they're supposed to be, on Yidden Kitikunam, Yidden are behaving the way they're supposed to behave, so their land and their place where they live is in Eretz Yisrael. This is the territory Hashem chose for them. This is the Jewish homeland. Azay, that is, Azay hat der Eibishter Beiche gewen Bavel, so Hashem chose Bavel as a territory for Yidden, als der Ort von Galus for Yidden. This is the place where Yidden should be living in the time period of Galus. Farzmana Galus, and Yidden zene b'shayches achateinu, in a time period when Yidden have sinned, and the Yidden cannot then reside in Eretz Yisrael, so their homeland is replaced, that instead Hashem chooses Bavel for them. So the connection of Bavel to Eretz Yisrael is only in this aspect of the Bechira, of Hashem choosing a homeland for the Yidden. And the Rebbe is the Rambam Medaye Kishem She'asa Lotzis Me'aretz V'chulu. And that's, we see here precisely in the word of the Rambam, just by skipping this one word. And he says Me Ha'aretz and not Eretz Yisrael, the Rambam is pointing this out. Nit Me Eretz Yisrael, nor Ha'aretz mit Hei Ayidiyah. Rather Ha'aretz, the land, with the Hei Ayidiyah, the known chosen land. Der Aretz. Was ist von Tamid ausgeteilt und ausgewählt von Al-Ala Aratzis. This land which is separated and is chosen from all other lands, the mitvas HaKadosh Baruch Hu hat es Beiche gewen, by the fact that Hashem chose it. Was mit dem is a Madgish. So the Rambam, by saying Ha'aretz, he's emphasizing, as der Isser Yitzir, was read da, is nit mitzat Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. When he speaks here about not leaving Eretz Yisrael, he's not talking about the holiness of the land. Now mitzadem was the Rebbe is Beiche gewen als Eretz for Yidden. Rather, he's speaking about the fact that Eretz Yisrael is a land that Hashem chose for Yidden. Und bis man Galus ist derselbe Tam Chal auf der Yitzia von Bavel Kishem wie auf der Yitzia von Eretz Yisrael. The same reason that applies to Eretz Yisrael, that Hashem chose it as their homeland in the time of Galus, it applies to Bavel, that Hashem chose it as their homeland. That's the comparison that the Rambam is saying here between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Eretz Yisrael, that is, that was chosen, and Bavel that was chosen. If then bringt the Rambam den Pasuk, so now when the Rambam brings the Pasuk Shenema Bavel Yuval V'Shama Yiu, that Hashem says that the Yidden are brought to Bavel and they should remain there. Araye, as the Eibishter had Beiche gewen Bavel atzmakim Agolas V'Yidden. What's the Rambam bringing from this Pasuk Bavel Yuval? The Pasuk here is not telling you that there's a new concept that Hashem wants Yidden to remain in Bavel for whatever reason it may be. Now the pasuk is actually coming to make the point that we see that Hashem chose Bavel as the homeland for Yidden. So therefore this answers the question that the Rebbe asked before, that the Rambam seems to contradict himself. He starts off saying that the reason you shouldn't leave Bavel is similar to this, that you shouldn't leave Eretz Yisrael. And then he brings a different reason, that there's a pasuk that says that Hashem doesn't want Yidden to leave Bavel. But the answer is, as the Rebbe says here, this pasuk is just coming to prove the point that Hashem chose Bavel as the place for Yidden when they're in Galus. Once you know that that's true, so now this that they don't leave Bavel, shouldn't leave Bavel, is similar to this that they shouldn't leave Eretz Yisrael, as the Rambam begins saying. Now to answer the question, how could you bring any proof from this pasuk if it's speaking about Klisharis? It's not even speaking about Yidden. As their pasuk read wegen Klisharis. So this pasuk is not speaking about Yidden, it's speaking about the Klisharis. Und der Masha sagt, as lefizeh is this nit kein loshen tzivui. This pasuk is not even to be read as a command. Nor Yirmiyah misnabe sheken yeh. Rather, Yirmiyah is simply prophesizing the fact that this is what will happen, that the Klisharis will be brought down to Bavel when the Yidden will be exiled. Lerent the Rambam nitazai. However, the Rambam explains the pasuk not this way. Not afila b'negeya de klisharis is the soichat sivui. Even regarding the klisharis that the pasuk speaks about, this is a command. Das heißt, as mitar the klisharis nitareis nemen from Bavel. One may not take the klisharis out of this place of Bavel. Afila ibsevet zayin meglachkeit of them. Even if the Yidden will have a possibility to take it out of Bavel. Now shama yiu, they should keep the klisharis there in this place. That's what the pasuk is saying. So what do we understand from this? If Hashem wants the klisharis to remain specifically in Bavel, and from them versteht man euch benegei zu Yidden. So therefore from this we can understand also regarding Yidden, as Bavel hat der Eibishter ausgeklippen als Zehe Ort from Makom Galus. Why does the Eibishter not want the klisharis to be taken out of Bavel? Because this is the homeland now for Yidden. This is the unique place that Hashem chose for Yidden. So therefore the klisharis should remain there. So therefore this applies to Yidden as well, and Zaytan from Dart and Tareizgan, and therefore they may not leave this place. So the point over here is, if the pasuk Bavel Yuvo would be coming to prove this itself, that there's an isser of Yidden to leave Bavel, so then there's absolutely no raya from this pasuk. The pasuk is speaking about the klisharis. But since, as the Rabbi said, Bavel Yuvo is only coming to choose the fact that Hashem chose Bavel as the unique homeland for Yidden. So memele you understand that Yidden are not allowed to leave Bavel. So then you could bring a raya from this pasuk. Just like we see regarding klisharis, that it's chosen as the special territory for the klisharis to remain there, so too it could be applied for Yidden as well. And this also explains what Taisva says. Ubemele is move on, so therefore it's understood, as in them is nitok and unterschied zwischen Zman Galus Rishon and Zman Galus Sheni. There's no difference between the first or second exile. Wie bald as me gefindt, as dafke Bavel hat der Eibishter Beiche gewen als Galus Art. Since we find in the pasuk that in the galus condition of Klal Yisrael, this is the homeland that Hashem chooses for Yidden, and an eifim from Shama Yiu shall kvius, and the pasuk emphasizes Shama Yiu, that in the time of galus, this is where Yidden have to permanently be. Al derech b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael ba'eifim shall kvius fardem zman ha'geula v'shanim kitikunam. Just like we find regarding Eretz Yisrael that Hashem chooses it to be fardem zman ha'geula v'shanim kitikunam. That is, Hashem chooses Eretz Yisrael for a time period of redemption, and when Yidden are behaving appropriately, so then they belong to be in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, what we see here is that there's two time periods or two conditions of Klal Yisrael. The time period of Geula, Yidden belong to be in Eretz Yisrael, and that's the homeland Hashem chooses for Yidden. Then there's the time period of Galus, so even though they're being exiled from a homeland, but Hashem still chooses a permanent homeland for them, and that is Bavel. So once the Torah tells this us regarding the first Galus, so we understand that this is the homeland for Yidden when they are in this condition of Galus, so it applies equally to the second Galus as well. Leitem can auskommen noch an Afgemine zwischen the shittis von Rashi, Miri, and Rambam. So based on this, that we understand now that according to the Rambam, this that a Yid may not leave Bavel is a very, very powerful thing, because this is mamish the homeland that Hashem permanently chooses for Yidden. So there's another difference that comes out here between the Rashi and the Rambam. The Rebbe said before, Rashi says that the reason you shouldn't leave Bavel is because of the Torah and the yeshivas that are there. The Das Rashi, as the time is lefi sheyesham yeshivas amrabitzis Torah, that you shouldn't leave Bavel only because there's the yeshivas that are teaching Torah there. Is move on, as in fall when the yeshivas amrabitzis Torah is in Bavel, not in another Medina. So if it's going to be a time period that the yeshivas are not in Bavel, but they are in a different country and there are the yeshivas, so darf dort chal sein the isi yitzir l'shara ratzis. So the issa should apply not only to Bavel, but then it will apply to other lands as well. There's nothing permanent about Bavel, so it's the reason of the yeshivas. So it could apply to other places as well. However, according to the Rambam, as das is mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu beBavel als the makom hagalus, that there's something about Bavel that Hashem chooses it as the homeland of Yidden, is muvan as the Issa blois by the Yitziyah from Bavel, that this is an Issa that only applies to Yidden leaving Bavel, und nicht by the Yitziyah von an ander makom Torah. And there is no Issa that applies to leaving another place where Yidden are, where there's a place of Torah. Was is bedaimet to the Yitziyah mei ha'aretz l'chutz ha'aretz. Because leaving Bavel is similar to leaving Eretz Yisrael from Aretz, that is, to Chutz La'aretz. But not, it doesn't apply if there's Torah in any other place, that doesn't apply there. Al pizeh vere musber the andere the yukim. So based on everything we've explained about what the Rambam means when he's quoting Bavel Yuvo, we could answer the other questions that we asked before. But before I just continue further, there's one question that the Rebbe does not clearly answer inside the Sikha here, which is regarding the Gemara, where it's divided in two statements. Rabbi Yehuda speaks about not returning to Eretz Yisrael, and then Rabbi Yehuda Mashmol speaks about not going from Bavel to any other lands, and it's not clear which one of these two statements that Rambam is quoting. He sort of combines it all together as one. So from what it says in the Order 46, you could see that the Rebbe is saying that the Rambam is actually quoting the second statement of Rabbi Yehuda Mashmol. That when the Gemara says that you shouldn't leave Bavel to all other Aratzos, this includes Eretz Yisrael as well, and the Rambam is saying that the pasuk Bavel Yuva, which was quoted in the first statement of Rav Yehuda, that is, also goes in the second statement as well. Even though in the Gemara it's not actually brought, but he's relying on this that he already brought the pasuk before regarding not returning to Eretz Yisrael. So in the second statement, when he talks about not leaving Bavel to any other lands, it's also based on this pasuk. And the Rambam is essentially quoting the second statement of Rav Yehuda Mashmol. That's what it looks like. Okay, let's continue inside. But there were the other questions that the Rebbe asked before, and they'll all be answered. And the Rebbe goes through them quickly again. Aleph, was der Rambam sagt, nit kishem she'atzu lotzeis me'ha'aretz le'Bavel. The Rambam does not say that one may not leave from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. The Rambam says, kishem, just like you're not allowed to leave me'ha'aretz l'chutz la'aretz. And Beis was sagt nit kach Oster lotzeis mi'Bavel le'Eretz Yisrael leitem kesef Mishnah. The Rambam does not say that one may not leave Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, but the Rambam just says you may not leave Bavel to any place. On Gimel, the third point, fiert nit ois wie in Gemara. The Rambam does not quote the pasuk fully as it is in the Gemara. Ad yoim pakti oisam num Hashem. He just brings the first part of the pasuk. So based on what we explained until here regarding Bavel, that according to the Rambam, the proof from this pasuk and the point about Bavel is that Hashem chose it as the homeland for Yidden in this condition of Galos, so we can understand as follows. In dem Isse Yitziyah Ma'aretz, Mitzad B'chirasa Durach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This that you may not leave Eretz Yisrael because Hashem chose it as His land is Bavel gleich und is Kalul in Chutz La'aretz. In that sense, Bavel is equal to any other place in Chutz La'aretz. There's no reason to point out Bavel separately than the rest of Chutz La'aretz. Eretz Yisrael is the chosen land, and all the other territories Hashem gave to other nations. Therefore, the Rambam says, Oster lotzeis miha'aretz l'chutz la'aretz, to make it clear that he's speaking about this point, and that is the unique bechira that there is in Eretz Yisrael, and all other lands are not necessarily the same. On the other hand, if you would be talking about the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, so then, outside of Eretz Yisrael, not necessarily could you say that all other territories, which do not have that Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, but they're not all necessarily the same. Bavel, where there's more Torah, has more Kedusha. Other places outside of Eretz Yisrael that has no Torah has even less Kedusha. So if you talk about the Kedusha, maybe there is a reason to point out Bavel specifically, in contrast to Eretz Yisrael. But if you speak about the Bechira of the Eibishter, so the Bechira of the Eibishter is only in Eretz Yisrael, and all other lands, there's no Bechira at all. So therefore they're all the same. So therefore the Rambam says, one may not leave Eretz Ha'aretz to Chutz La'aretz. Everything else is the same. Azayayich in dem Isse Yitziyah mi Bavel. When the Rambam speaks about leaving Bavel, mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, based on the fact that Hashem chose Bavel, als Mokken Galus, the homeland of Yidden in the time of Galus, is Ladas, the Kesef Mishnah, Eretz Yisrael, gleich Mitshara Ratzais. In this sense, now that this becomes the homeland of Yidden, so in that sense, Eretz Yisrael, all other lands, is the exact same thing. There's a reason why the Rambam brings this halacha, including Eretz Yisrael, together with all other lands, and doesn't point out Eretz Yisrael separately. Because in this sense, when Bavel is chosen as the homeland, so this is the choice, this is the place, and all other places are the same. Again, the same point like it is in the reverse regarding Eretz Yisrael in contrast to all other places. So over here, now that Hashem chooses Bavel, everything else is the same. But if you would be focusing on the Kedusha of Bavel, if there was something that's unique about the yeshivas in Bavel, so then maybe you could say Eretz Yisrael is also has yeshivas, maybe not as much as Bavel, so you can't put Eretz Yisrael in the same category as all other lands. And maybe there's another reason why Eretz Yisrael should be different. But the Rambam is talking about the Bechira. The Bechira of Bavel, in that sense, all other territories and Eretz Yisrael are all included together. On lefizeh, zoich move on. As does Negeya Nar. In the Rambam, the only thing that it's relevant for the Rambam when he wants to prove that Hashem chose Bavel, Nar, Bavela Yuvo, V'shama Yu. The only thing the Rambam is coming to prove is that this is the place that Hashem chose for Yidden to be permanently in the time of Galus. As the Rebishter hat Beiche gewen Bavel als Mokim Kavua Legalus. This is their permanent homeland in the time of Galus. Aber nicht das Siyam HaKasef. The fact that one day Hashem will remember us and redeem us, that's not relevant here. According to the Rambam, what are we trying to prove over here? If the pasuk Bavela Yuvov Yishama is coming to prove that Hashem wants Eden to stay there and you may not leave. This is the source of the Oster that you may not leave. So then, maybe the conclusion of the pasuk is relevant. As the Rabbi will soon explain. But the Rambam is not proving from this pasuk that you may not leave. He's proving something before that this is the choice of Hashem as the permanent homeland for the Eden. And that we see in the words, Bavel Yuvov V'Shamayu. Memele, you understand that you may not go anywhere else. So therefore the Rambam only quotes this part of the pasuk. That kegen Rabbi Yehuda in the Gemara. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda in the Gemara bringt Yeda Siyam HaKasef, does quote the conclusion of the pasuk. Varom sagt, Kol ha'olam mibavel le'eretz Yisrael oiver be'eser. Rabbi Yehuda, when he quotes the pasuk in the first statement of Rabbi Yehuda, is specifically speaking about leaving from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, that Yoiva and Esav, what it says in this pasuk, und bescheiches zu Eile sein ken Eretz Yisrael, is das Oich u be'ikim mudgish in Siyam HaKasef. Over here, it's emphasized, and primarily in the end of the pasuk, Ad Yoim Pak Diyaisam Num Hashem. Hashem says that now it's a time when I expel you from Eretz Yisrael, and I don't want you returning to Eretz Yisrael until the day I'll remember and redeem you. Do not return to this land until the day that I will bring you back here, until the day I remember you. So in that context, the end of the pasuk is relevant. But the Rambam is proving something else, that Bavel is the place that was chosen as the homeland for Yidden in the time of Galus. So therefore, he doesn't quote this part of the pasuk. So now, based on this understanding that the Rambam here is speaking about Eretz Yisrael and Bavel regarding the specific thing of the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael, and in that sense, Bavel is compared. So let's take a broader look over here at a few halachas in the Rambam, where the Rambam speaks about Eretz Yisrael. And actually, as the Rebbe pointed out before, that regarding Eretz Yisrael itself, there's actually two aspects to the living in Eretz Yisrael and the advantage of Eretz Yisrael. There's the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and then also the Bechira, this that Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael. So if we look more in the halachas of the Rambam before this halacha that we're speaking about, we'll see that in the Rambam, when he speaks about Eretz Yisrael, he speaks about both the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael and the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael. So leitem is verstandig, halachas in Rambam. So now we can understand the continuation of all the halachas over here in the Rambam in this Perek in Hilchas Malachim. Nach the halachas, following, it begins first, the Rambam there brings the halachas, the details, in an Isser, to weinen in Eretz Mitzrayim. When the Rambam speaks about this, that it's forbidden for a Yid to live in Eretz Mitzrayim. Und eisfirindik, and the Rambam there concludes and says, as there is a lishkin ba'vachulu, that this that a Yid may not live in Mitzrayim is mipnei shemaseh mekulkolin yaisim mikala aratzis chulu, because Mitzrayim is a very low place and the people there behave very inappropriately. Is there mamshech? So the Rambam then continues and says, in halachates, in the Ktsei Avchi. So the Rambam then goes to the opposite extreme and now explains that you do not live in Mitzrayim because it's such a low place. And then he says, Oster lotis meretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz lo'ilam. On the other hand, one that's in Eretz Yisrael may not leave Eretz Yisrael for chutz la'aretz forever. So what do we understand from the context of the way that Rambam brings this? Well, das is be'ikir mitzad the kedusha. Was is done in Eretz Yisrael legabe shara aratzis. So the contrast here shows us that the Rambam is focusing primarily on being in Eretz Yisrael because of the kedusha, the holiness, that it's a very high holy place. The presence of Hashem is there. In contrast to Mitzrayim, which is a very low place, mekulkolim. That's the first halacha. And then inyan from kedusha Eretz Yisrael, regarding this subject of the holiness of the land, is the Rambam mamshich in the Vaita de Halachas. The Rambam elaborates more in the following halachas. In the following halacha, the Rambam says, Gedolei Chachamim hoyim menashkin al tchumei Eretz Yisrael chulu. The great sages, they would kiss, when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they would kiss the land. Amru Chachamim kol ha'sheichem be'Eretz Yisrael avinoisev mechulim v'chulu. And another halacha, the Rambam says that one that lives in Eretz Yisrael, all of his sins will be forgiven. And then, Erst and halacha Yud Beis, following all of these details, where the Rambam speaks very strongly about the holiness that there is in the land. So then in halacha Yud Beis, Zakter dem din, here the Rambam tells us, as was quoted in the beginning of the Sikhe, La'olam Yadar Adam Beretz Yisrael, Afila b'ir sheruba akum. You should live in Eretz Yisrael even in a city that's mostly Goyim. Val yada b'chutz la'aretz, and you should not live in chutz la'aretz. And then the Rambam says, Shekol ha'yotze l'chutz la'aretz ki'ilu oved avodah zarah, one that lives in chutz la'aretz. It's like you're serving avodah zarah. Shenam v'kigeshuna yeh mistapech b'nachlas Hashem le'im alech avodah l'kim acherim. It's like you're being expelled, and when you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, you're serving idols. Then the Rambam quotes another pasuk where it speaks about punishment, and there it says, "Val admas Yisrael lo yavoyu," that to the land of Yidden they should not come. Those that serve idols. So the Rambam in this halacha, in halacha Yud Beis, what is the Rambam speaking about here? When he speaks about the advantage of living in Eretz Yisrael, that you should even live in Eretz Yisrael, even amongst Goyim. Is the Rambam here speaking about the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, or is he speaking about the bechira of Hashem in the land? So here, if you look into the words of the Rambam, you could see that he's sort of including both. But then, over here in this halacha, is nit kein hechra mitzad welche iyin das is. It's not clear 100%. The Rambam is not wording this halacha in a way that it's only one aspect, only the kedusha, or only the bechira of Eretz Yisrael. As an adab beit time, we could see here in the words of the Rambam that he's including both details, the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael and also the bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. Tzalib the kedusha miyechedes was in Eretz Yisrael mitzad ashras hashchina. On one hand, you could see in the Rambam that the reason you should live specifically in Eretz Yisrael is because of the special holiness that there is, because of the shchina that's present there. This is mashma from the Mloshen, as hayetzel l'chutz la'aretz ki'ilu haved avodah zarah. This explains what the Rambam says here, that if you leave Eretz Yisrael, it's like you're serving idols. Meaning, when you're in Eretz Yisrael, so there's the shechina there, so you could serve Hashem. When you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, there's a concealment of Hashem's presence, so it's harder to serve Hashem there. So it's like you serve avodah zarah. So that aspect of what the Rambam says is related to the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And also, to leave them was the Rebbe start beichig in Eretz Yisrael. But you also see in the Rambam here that one should choose to live Eretz Yisrael, and even amongst Goyim, is because of the choice that Hashem chose this land for the homeland of the Yidden. Where do you see this in the Rambam? As it seems from the proof that the Rambam brings, was ruft iran und sagt dem tam nachlas Hashem. This is Hashem's inheritance, meaning that this is the choice, that Hashem chose this as the homeland for the Yidden. Und abgegeben dem Yidden, the Yidden, and Hashem gave this land for the Yidden. So from this lashon of nachlas Hashem, the Rambam is also alluding to the fact that there's another aspect of being in Eretz Yisrael, which is the bechira, that Hashem chose this land as the inheritance of the Yidden. Vasal pizeh yomtak. If we'll say that the Rambam here is also including the bechira in the land, so not leaving Eretz Yisrael is not only because of the kedusha, but also the choice of the Yidden's homeland. So with this, we can understand better the choice of the words of the Rambam here. But the Rambam says, "Shekol hayotze l'chutz la'aretz ki'ilu haved avodah zarah." The one that leaves Eretz Yisrael, it's like he's serving idols. Heipecha bechira, and when it says ki'ilu haved avodah, so leaving Eretz Yisrael is going against the fact that Hashem chose this as your land. You're rejecting Hashem's choice. So what's the term that Rambam uses? Yaitze. When you leave, when you exit Eretz Yisrael, you're rejecting Hashem's choice. That's what this indicates. As the Rebbe points out here, Nit v'in Gemara, the Rambam's lashon that he says, Yaitze, leaving, is unlike the expression that it says in the Gemara. What does the Gemara say? Shekol adar be'Eretz Yisrael, doime k'mishi yesh lo yalakah. One that lives in Eretz Yisrael. So then, this is a person that's someone that has a God that's there present in Eretz Yisrael. And one that lives outside Eretz Yisrael, he's someone that has no God. So the Gemara focuses on where are you living? Where are you residing permanently? Not talking about the moment of leaving. The Rambam, however, focuses on Yaitse, the moment that you leave. The Rambam himself actually before speaks about living in Eretz Yisrael. Lo'ilam yador, that you should live in Eretz Yisrael, and you should not live outside Eretz Yisrael. But then the Rambam adds, Shekol ha'yotze, one that exits, when you leave Eretz Yisrael. So what it seems like is, what the Rambam is saying over here is, and the Rebbe explains this in Hara 56, that there's two different things here. There's living in Eretz Yisrael, but then there's that moment that you leave. Living in Eretz Yisrael refers to the experience that you're going to have while you are there in Eretz Yisrael. Being in Eretz Yisrael, in a place where there's the Shechina that's revealed, the Kedusha that you'll feel and sense, that's the advantage of the Kedusha of while you're there in Eretz Yisrael. But then the moment of you leaving, that moment when you walk out of Eretz Yisrael, you're rejecting Hashem's gift. So when the Rambam says Yaitse, he's talking about that moment of leaving. So the issue over here is not only the fact that you're leaving the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, but it's also the fact that you're throwing away the gift that Hashem chose this gift for you. That's why the Rambam is focusing on Yaitse, on that moment of you leaving and rejecting the gift. Und danach ist Meramis, euch dem zweiten Tam und is Meirich und is Masei vel atmas Yisrael. But then, after the Rambam brings this Kol HaYotze, and he brings the pasuk of Gershuni Ayem Mistapeach, the Rambam brings another pasuk, vel atmas Yisrael, and he's emphasizing with this that here he's going back to the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, that it's the land of Yidden, that it's a place where you could see and express and feel, that is, and experience the Kedusha of the land that belongs to Yidden. So we could see here in this halacha of the Rambam that while he's continuing the theme of what he spoke about before, which is the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, but he also includes specifically the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. Und der Rebbe, so therefore, schreibt us der Rambam zum Sof von alle halachas von Meiles in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, this halacha, where the Rambam speaks about the fact that a Yid should live in Eretz Yisrael, the Rambam brings this here last. Nit wie es hat l'chayre gedav zayin dem Seder. Not like you would think the Seder should be. What's the order here in the Rambam? In the previous halachas, the Rambam speaks about the fact that one should not leave Eretz Yisrael. And then, after that, in Halacha Yud Beis, he talks about the fact that you should live in Eretz Yisrael. What would be the right order? First, the Rambam should talk about the positive, about where you should live. And then after he tells you where you should live, he can come and tell you, don't leave this place. But instead, the Rambam does it the other way around. First, the Rambam speaks about not going out of Eretz Yisrael. And then the Rambam here talks about living in Eretz Yisrael. And so why doesn't the Rambam nicht an Umfang von the Dine Eretz Yisrael? So this halacha here, the Rambam does not bring all the way in the beginning. Why? Far them also lots is Eretz Yisrael, before he speaks about leaving Eretz Yisrael. Why? Weil da retter euch die Meilas ha-Bechire von Eretz Yisrael. Because over here, the Rambam is also focusing on the Bechire, this that Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the order of the Rambam is, first he speaks about Mitzrayim, where the people there are very low, and therefore you should not leave, you should not go live in Mitzrayim. And then the Rambam brings up that the Kedusha, in contrast, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is so powerful, therefore you should not leave Eretz Yisrael because of its Kedusha. And then the Rambam goes on to add, besides the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, there's also the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael. This is not in contrast to Mitzrayim. I mean, this whole discussion all began with Mitzrayim. So in contrast to Mitzrayim, the Rambam begins first with the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And then later the Rambam adds that in Eretz Yisrael there's another very important thing, and that is the fact that Hashem chose it as the homeland for Yidden. So that the Rambam brings last. Und der Rebbe, wenn kommt, behemshich lezeh, so then, following up to this point, where the Rambam also includes the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael, zum Issa Yitzia mi Bavel, l'shar haratzes misad Bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here the Rambam also brings this, that one in the time of Galus should not leave Bavel, similar to this that Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael, Hashem chose Bavel. Is a medayik, Hashem she'asa lotzeis meha oretz. Over here the Rambam is very specific and he says that you may not leave oretz, and he does not mention Eretz Yisrael, but this is madgish as the Issa Yitzia. Da is mitam bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Issa not to leave Eretz Yisrael that we're speaking about over here is only because of the Bechira that David chose the land. Was in dem gleicht sich aus die Yitzia mi haaretz mit den Issel Latzes mi Bavel chulu kanal. And this is the comparison of not leaving Bavel to not leaving Eretz Yisrael. It's only the Bechira. The Kedusha is only in Eretz Yisrael, but the Bechira that Hashem chose Bavel as a permanent homeland for Yidden in the time of Galus, in that sense, Bavel is similar to the Bechira of the Eibishter in Oretz, which is the Bechira of the Eibishter in Eretz Yisrael. So now, Al Pizez, move on, coming back to the question that the Rebbe asked before regarding this, that we find that there were many Amoraim that did leave Bavel for Eretz Yisrael, and then they left Eretz Yisrael for Bavel. So now it's understood, was me gefind kam Amoraim, was haben Eile gewähm wie Bavel Eretz Yisrael, that left Bavel for Eretz Yisrael. Man muss nicht sagen, as es eine Mechulik mit Rabbi Yehuda, zi mit Rabbi Yehuda am Shmuel. And we don't have to say that they were arguing with Rabbi Yehuda, or with what Rabbi Yehuda quoted in the name of Shmuel. So what's the point here? Since this that one may not leave Bavel for Eretz Yisrael or any other lands, is the same like one may not leave Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, which is mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the Eibish's choice that he chose Yidden, that he chose Eretz Yisrael, that is, as the homeland. And then in the time of Galus, Hashem chose Bavel as the whole land. Not that when it says that you may not leave Bavel, there's some unique reason of not leaving Bavel. Ledugme, what would be a unique reason? Ratzon Malchusa in Bavel. There's a Ratzon Malchusa in Bavel. Not 100% sure what Ratzon Malchusa here means. Could only guess. Maybe Ratzon Malchusa means the Ratzon of the Eibishter. The Eibishter has a unique Ratzon about Yidden being Dafke in Bavel. Or maybe Ratzon Malchusa. I believe that's what it means. Upon him. So, if you would say, let me just stop here for a second, if you would say that you may not leave Bavel for a unique reason, something unique about Bavel. So even though the Gemara sort of equates that just like you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, so too you're not allowed to leave Bavel for any other lands or for Eretz Yisrael, but really they're not the same at all. Not leaving Bavel is an issa for itself, that there's something unique about Bavel, that Hashem wants Yidden to remain in Bavel, or maybe sort of to remain stuck in Bavel. There's a Ratzon Malchus that Hashem wants, don't leave here. This is Golus now, and remain a Dafke in Bavel. So if that would be the reason, so then this is an absolute issa. There would be no het teirim for this. Now, as the Rebbe is going to point out soon, when it comes to leaving Eretz Yisrael for Chutz La'aretz, there are het teirim to this. But if we're going to say that in Bavel, there's a unique ratzon of the Eibishter that Yidden should not leave Bavel, so then there'd be no het teirim for that. But rather, kishem she'oser kach oser. When the Rambam quotes, just like one may not leave Eretz Yisrael because Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael, so too you may not leave Bavel because Hashem chose Bavel, and we are equating it to Eretz Yisrael, is move on, so it's understood, and we could apply the heteirim of Eretz Yisrael much more so to Bavel, as in them zene the zelbe heteirim from the Issa Yitziyah, that the same heteirim that apply by the Issa of leaving Eretz Yisrael apply over here to Bavel. Das heißt, meaning, Punkt, wie benegei Yitziyah Eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz, just like when it comes leaving Eretz Yisrael, zenen da tnoyim v'memeg, there are conditions that you may leave. Wie the Rambam paskin, l'il meteire, v'cheinu yetzel l'scheire, to leave teire, or it says there to get married, and also for business reasons. Azay zeseich benegei zu aliyah from Bavel Eretz Yisrael, v'yitziyah l'shara aratzis. Same as with leaving Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, or leaving Bavel for any other place. As oips is l'il meteire, v'l'scheire, v'chayetze b'zeh es mutalatzis. But if it's for the purpose of learning Torah or for business, you may leave. Because the Rebbe is explaining that when the Rambam says Kashem Kach, we have to take this literally. That there's actually a Bechira in Bavel similar to the Bechira in Eretz Yisrael. That's the incredible Chiddush over here from the Rebbe in the Sikhe. Wie bald aber, as das is nor a heter tzlieb oisfiren a tachlis, Torah schreire. But since this is a heter, this is a special heter for a specific purpose, it's geschehen wie bei der Yitziyah von Eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. Leidet noyim amutarim. Just like when it comes leaving the Eretz Yisrael for chutz la'aretz, which is only with these special conditions. Bleibt euch nachdem benegeya lenitten zeh a ben Eretz Yisrael und es chayav lachzer. So he remains a person that's from Eretz Yisrael. He remains a ben Eretz Yisrael even after he leaves Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't lose that status of who he is. And therefore he's obligated to return when the reason that he left does not apply anymore. So too also, one that leaves Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, in those conditions where it's allowed, bleibt euch Eretz Yisrael a ben Bavel. Even after he leaves Eretz Yisrael, he remains a ben Bavel. He belongs, his permanent place of where he resides is Bavel. Bitzad de Bchire in Bavel, als Galus, because in the time of Galus, Hashem chose Bavel. And that is mechoyev lachzer, and therefore he's obligated to return to Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is the achiluk in the tnaim und tachlis hayitziyah aliyah. But here there's a difference depending what the conditions were. That was the reason that you left. If the heter of why one left is because he went for business reasons, is in them farana kitzva. This is something that has a set amount of time that you have to get done, your dealings, and then that's what it is for. And when you've made your profit and your business dealings are done, you have to go back. On the other hand, someone that goes out to learn Torah, but das is beli kitzva. Learning Torah, it's never ending, the amount of Torah that you could learn. Is Kozmanes kennen noch zukommen in Limudat Torah, meger bleiben in Eretz Yisrael. So it's possible that if one leaves and he can always learn more and more Torah, so he's leaving from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, so then he could remain in Eretz Yisrael. So bis das moving bepashtos was kama amiraim haben eile gewen mi Babel Eretz Yisrael. We could understand why we find that many amiraim did leave from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, and they're not arguing with Rabbi Yehuda. Varam das is gewen mitzad dem heter. They left for Eretz Yisrael because of this heter to learn Torah there. Und die sind dort geblieben bekwies, and so those that left and remained there in Eretz Yisrael permanently, is das gewende Fahr, weil hat sich gefadet mitzad zeyer öfen von limudat Torah. Their level of learning required that they remain in Eretz Yisrael, and they kept on gaining and learning more and more Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Aber by Rav, und al derech zeh by Shmuel, but when it comes to Rav and Shmuel, so over here, as the Rebbe quoted before, they were originally in Babel, they went to Eretz Yisrael, but then they eventually returned to Babel. They did go to Eretz Yisrael for the purpose to learn Torah. But once they received from Rabbi Torah to the fullest extent possible, they had to return to Babel. And actually there in Babel they were able to learn Torah on an even much higher level. As the Rebbe here brings later in the Hara. Here the Rebbe brings it also in the Pnim of the Siche. Und nachmer, Dafke in Babel, is später zugekommen auf dem, was sie haben gelernt in Eretz Yisrael. Later, when they came back to Babel, they were able to learn Torah even much greater. In Ion, a pilpul de Torah, in analyzing and deeper discussion in Torah, pilpul at Talmidim, coming from the students that they learned with in Babel. Was in them is given, the Yisrael from Babel of Eretz Yisrael. That's the great advantage that they had in returning to Babel. So the point over here is that based on everything that Rebbe said in the Sikha, the main chiddush of the Sikha is that Bavel, there's a Bechira in Bavel, similar to the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael. So when the Gemara and the Rambam compares Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, it's not just sort of an external comparison that there's an Issa for leaving Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, so too there's an Issa from leaving Bavel to Eretz Yisrael or any other lands. It's a real comparison. There's a real Bechira like in Eretz Yisrael, so too in the time of Golus and Bavel as well. So therefore, the same halachas and hatarim that apply in Eretz Yisrael also apply to Babel. Now the Rebbe comes back and explains these two aspects of Eretz Yisrael and Babel in relation to the Yidden as well. And then, based on this, the Rebbe will come to a much deeper explanation in the difference between the Bechira and the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Kishem v'yezenedot zwei meiles in Eretz Yisrael. So just like we have these two great advantages of Eretz Yisrael. Das was HaKadosh Baruch Hu bacham ma mikol ha'aratzis. The fact that Hashem chose it of all other lands. Und die Kedusha was is da here. And also there is the special holiness in the land. Azai zenedot the beide meiles oich by Yidden. Same is also these two meiles we find by Yidden, as the Rebbe quoted before from the Midrashim. Das was Yidden zenen die, was der Eibishter hat sei beiche gewet. Yidden are the Eibishter's chosen nation. Und das was Yidden haben in sich Kedusha. And then there is the fact that Yidden have in themselves a special holiness, mitzad zer verbund mit Torah und mitzvahs. And this is because of the Torah Yidden learn, the connection that they have to Torah and mitzvahs, so there's a special kedusha that there is in Yidden. Und the chiluk tzavishn zei. What is the difference between this, that Hashem chooses Yidden as His nation, and the holiness that there is in Yidden through Torah and mitzvahs? Das, was der Eibishter hat beiche gewähnt, die Yidden von anderen Umais, this that Hashem chose Yidden of all other nations, Uvana v'charta mikol am v'loshen, Hashem chose us from all other nations, is nit verbunden mit seinem Meilu Kedusha, is not connected specifically with a special level or holiness that Yidden have, mitzah, Torah, or mitzvahs, because of the Torah and mitzvahs that we're connected to. Varom, damalt, is this nit keninyan from Bechira. Because if Yidden are holy, because of Torah and mitzvahs, so then it's not a choice. Hashem is not choosing us apart from other nations. The Rebbe explains, Bechira mitis, what is true choice, is shayach in an Eifen, was is da dimien zwischen zwei Sachen, von welchem is Beiche. When you have two things, two objects, two people that are similar, and you choose one from the other. Und mit dem Koyach ha-Bechira, kleit men ois, eine von sei, and then the one that's choosing, it's his choice, purely his choice, that he chooses one from the other. But not that the object or the person himself already has a certain advantage where he already stands out from the other. So then it's not the one that chooses that's choosing him. The object itself already has its own Meile. Und der Rebbe, so therefore, wie bald, as mitzad Meiles ha-Kedusha und Torah und Mitzvahs is nicht shayach, kein Shum Dimyin zwischen Yidden und Kol Amen. This, that Yidden have a special holiness because of the Torah and Mitzvahs that they're connected to. So there's no comparison between a Yid and other nations. Legt sich da nicht der Inyan ha-Bechira. So the whole concept of Bechira is not applicable here. Muslim sagen, so therefore we must say, as the Bechire is nitzalib Kedushas Yisrael, this that it says that Hashem chose Yidden is not because of their holiness, nor Adarabah, mitzad the Bechire von Eibishtin, is in Zay nimshach gewaren Kedusha v'chulu. It works in the reverse. The first thing is that Hashem chose the Yidden to be His people. Choosing the Yidden unrelated to Torah mitzvahs, even if they have no Kedusha, that aspect of a Yid, or as it says in other places, referring to the physical body of a Yid, that's similar to all other nations, Hashem chooses them to be His. Now that Hashem chooses them to be His, He also reveals in them, and as a result, this brings to the Yidden a special Kedusha in connection with Torah mitzvahs. So now it comes out as follows: as the Iskashrus von Yidden mit Neibishten mitzad b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the connection of the Hashem to the Yidden through this that Hashem chose the Yidden as His nation, is an atzmi dige und riert an in etzem von Yidden. So this is a very deep connection. It's the very essence of Hashem that's connected to the Yidden. Hashem is not choosing Yidden because of any advantages they have, any beautiful attributes, anything about their behavior, or anything. It's just the very essence of Yid, where you see no advantage of him over another, but nevertheless Hashem says, I choose Yidden as mine. Much more wie die Iskashrus mitzad ze kedusha und Torah mitzvahs. So this is a much deeper connection than the connection that's expressed through the kedusha of a Yid, and also through this that a Yid has Torah mitzvahs. Was das is kaviyachol v'yadav neisef. That aspect of the connection of Yidden to the Eibishter is, so to speak, an additional feature to the Yidden that they connect through this to the Eibishter. In klare Wörter, to say this in more clearer words, the Iskashrus von Yidden mit dem Eibishter mitzat b'chire, the connection of the Yidden to the Eibishter because of the fact that Hashem chose the Yidden, is wie atzmusai umuhusai verbindt sich mit atzmus und muhus von Yidden. This is the very essence of Hashem Himself. It's purely coming from Hashem. There's no influence of any mila that Yidden have. That's the reason for the choice. It's coming purely from the very essence of Hashem. And what is Hashem choosing? He's not choosing any levels in Yidden, any darga, any advantages they have, but He's choosing the very identity, the very essence of the Yid. The Iskashrus von Yidden mitzad zeri kedusha, on the other hand, this that Hashem chooses Yidden because of the holiness that they have, was sie kommt durch Torah und mitzvahs, welche seine Chachmasei Ritzaini Yisbarach. So this kedusha of the Yidden comes through Torah and mitzvahs. What is Torah and mitzvahs? Hashem's wisdom and Hashem's will. Was mitzvah is doch maloshen tzavse v'chibah. The word mitzvah also means that it creates a connection and joins Yidden together with Hashem. Werte durch den verbunden mit Neibischen, so through doing mitzvahs you become connected. And azayach durch Torah, as Yisrael mekashram vayiraisa bekutshu b'richu, Yidden learn Torah and they connect to Torah, and through Torah they connect to Hashem. Is es doch nicht an Neufen, als der Etzem von Yidden verbindt sich millechatchile mit atzmus Mosi Yisbarach. So here we can see that this is a connection that's not that Hashem chooses Yidden, so then Yidden are essentially one. That here the choice makes us one from the beginning without having to have anything in between. Now das ist durch Eiraise Torah mitzvahs. Rather, this is a connection of Yidden to Hashem, which is a revealed connection, and this is revealed through Torah mitzvahs. When Al-Pizez move on, the Dik and Maimer Azal. This explains the expression the way the Zohar puts it. Tlas, Ksharem, Iskashron, Da Beda, that there are three knots that tie together these three. Yisrael miskashram vayiraisa, Yidden connect to Torah, and vayiraisa b'kudshe b'richu, and then through Torah they connect to Hashem. But the Zohar says that there are three knots here. So the question is, seemingly, when you tie three items together, or in this case you tie Yidden to Torah and Torah to Hashem, there should be two knots zwischen Yisrael and vayiraisa. One to tie the Yidden to Torah, and zwischen Eiraisa and Kudshe B'richu, and the second knot to tie Torah to the Eibishter, that is. So why does the Zohar say that there are three? Now the Asbara is, so the explanation here is, the Zohar is alluding to this deeper connection that there is between Yidden directly to the Eibishter himself. As Oster the Iskashrus Ayidei Torah, besides this connection that Yidden connect to Hashem through Torah, is da a kesher was bint zei die Yidden mit den Eibishter on shom memutza. There's a direct connection between Yidden and Hashem without any intermediary. Mitzad b'chirasa yizbarach. And this is what Chazal tell us, that Hashem chose Yidden directly. And the Ribber is tlas gesharim. So therefore, this is three knots, bedugmas tabas, just like when you have a ring. So over here, these three that are tied together, besides the knot that ties Yidden with Torah, there's also a knot on the other end of the Yidden, so to speak, where the Yidden tie directly to Hashem himself without the intermediary of Torah. And that's really the source, the real connection, the deepest connection of a Yid to Hashem. And then later, as a result of that, this connection is also revealed through the Torah mitzvahs, as the Rabbi will explain more in detail soon. But before we get to that, the Rabbi first brings this back to the connection of Hashem to Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, the Kedusha that there is in Eretz Yisrael, and the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. So let's go back to a point that we learned earlier in the Sikha. The difference between the Rambam and the Meiri regarding Bavel. L'das Rambam is the Issa Lotzis mi Bavel l'shar Ratzais mitzad b'chiris HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This, that a Yid may not leave Bavel, is because Hashem chose Bavel as his. On l'das Rashi, l'fi sheyesham yeshivas hamrabitzis Torah. According to Rashi, it's because of the yeshivas that teach Torah over there. So this really corresponds to the 2 points that the Rebbe said before. It's the Bechira. So according to the Rambam, in Bavel there's Bechira, and according to Rashi there's the Kedusha, the special Kedusha that comes from the Torah. Not compared to the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, but still there's a Kedusha because of the Torah there. But now the Rebbe adds an important point here. Heyayisabes is the Chaklal. We know that there's the following rule: as afushim achleikes loy mafshina. There's no reason to add arguments when we see these subjects, when many Rishonim are constantly arguing about every subject, really. But there's no reason to add in this argument here, and therefore Yeshloimar, we can say as oichle das Rashi va Meiri is da inyana bechira in Bavel. This point, the chiddush of the Sikha, that in Bavel there's a choice, that Hashem chose Bavel as the homeland of Yidden. This is true even according to the Rashi and the Meiri. So then why does Rashi say that it's because of the yeshivas there? Now the bechira gufe is verbunden mit kedushas atayre was is da in Bavel. This bechira itself, according to Rashi, it's a different nature of a bechira here. The bechira is because of the Torah that there is there in Bavel. So therefore, b'shas in Bavel, vert ois harbatzas ha-Torah, vert oich batli bechira. So therefore, when there's no Torah in Bavel, so therefore the bechira is not there anymore, is not applicable anymore. So both Rashi and the Rambam agree that what's unique about Bavel is that Hashem chose it, but it's a different kind of a choice. According to the Rambam, it's a true choice. It's Bechira Mitis, as the Rebbe said before. Bavel is chosen as the homeland of the Yidden, regardless of whether there is or isn't Torah there. According to the Rambam, Rashi, rather, that is, the Bechira is because of the Kedusha, because of the Torah that's there, and therefore that's a Bechira that's dependent on the Kedusha of the Torah being there. Aber b'negeya le'eretz Yisrael is anders. But when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, it's different. Over here, it's the other way around. So again, let me just summarize the point there. According to Rashi, the Bechira in Bavel begins first with the Kedusha, that it's a place of yeshivas and Torah and Kedusha, and as a result of the Kedusha comes the Bechira. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's in the reverse. On Ir Bechira is nit mitzad the Kedusha. The Bechira in Eretz Yisrael, even according to Rashi, is not as a result of the holiness that there's there. Was in Ir, Adarabbe, the Kedusha ko mitzad ulachreya Bechira. Here it's the other way around. The Kedusha comes only following, and as a result of this, that Hashem chooses Eretz Yisrael. As we can see, based on the midrashim that we had before, when we bald as Bechira HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael is a Bechira atzmis, k'shebara ha'olam. Since in Eretz Yisrael, it's a Bechira that Hashem chooses without any reasons, without any causes. He chooses it. He chooses when He creates the world, Eretz Yisrael, to be His. Zi is nachlas Hashem. This is Hashem's inheritance. Und hat es abgegeben Yidden mit der Bris Olam als der Mokim ha'atzmi für Yidden. And Hashem gives it as an everlasting covenant that this belongs to Yidden. Essentially, it's theirs, not based on any circumstances or advantages that the land has. Nit wie bei Babel, was is mitzad, was is tzalib, galus. Not like in Babel, where it's a condition of galus, and therefore Hashem chooses it. The far is dort the bechira anitzchizdige. So therefore, the bechira of Eretz Yisrael is an everlasting bechira. So over here, it seems like that the Rebbe is alluding to the fact that even according to the Rambam, there still is a difference between the bechira of Bavel and the bechira of Eretz Yisrael. The bechira of Bavel is only a galus condition. The bechira of Eretz Yisrael is an everlasting bechira. So that's the source of the concept. It begins with the bechira, and when Hashem created the world. Und der Inyan HaKedusha v'chulu sheberetz Yisrael, Peilt euch dem Gilui von Atem Bechira. And then the Kedusha then follows, as the Rebbe said before, but here the Rebbe adds another point. Not only does the Kedusha follow after the Bechira, but the Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael, the Torah and the mitzvahs, the special mitzvahs that there is in Eretz Yisrael, that Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael will actually have the effect to reveal and express Hashem's choice of Eretz Yisrael. Even though the Bechira of Hashem is something which is much deeper and is much more essential in the connection of Hashem to Eretz Yisrael than the Kedusha, but the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael will also have the impact to reveal Hashem's Bechira in Eretz Yisrael. How is this? Das Verstehen von dem Inyan wie der, das Verstehen von dem wie der Inyan ist bei Yidden. You can understand this from the way these two aspects of Bechira and Kedusha works regarding Yidden. So we're going to learn, of course, the Sikha over here with the Pnim of the Sikha without the Ha'aris, but the Ha'aris has most of the story over here. If you really want to get the full picture, learn the Ha'aris here. Afal pi as es da meile in der Eskashus von Yidden mitzad Bechira. So even though there's a tremendous advantage, as the Rebbe pointed out before, with the Bechira that Hashem chooses Yidden, Yisrael, v'Kodesh B'richu, it's just Hashem and the Yidden alone. But das is mitzad, that smusi is barach kanal. This is the essence of Hashem that chooses the essence of a Yid. Is aber da oich ha meile in der Eskashus mitzad kedushasam. But there's also an advantage in the connection that Yidden have to Hashem through the holiness, expressing the holiness of Hashem in them, mitzad Torah and mitzvahs, which comes with Torah and mitzvahs. And the advantage is as follows. In them Fabon mitzad Bechira Alei, this connection that Yidden have because Hashem chose them, hayais as das is now mitzad Bechirasai shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Since this is only a result of this that Hashem chooses, it's coming purely from above. No advantage, nothing that you could see in Yidden that's special about them. It comes completely from Hashem. There's no mile in Yidden. It's a fila la'achrei b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that even after Hashem chooses Yidden, zet sich das nit an in dem nifcha b'ifim gali. This will not necessarily be sensed and seen and experienced in the one that's chosen in a revealed sense. The mitzias of the one that's chosen, there's nothing about him that caused and then brings this bechira. So the bechira is purely Hashem. Hashem says it's mine, but it remains as is. The condition of it doesn't change. At least not in a revealed sense. Of course it does change, but not in a revealed sense that it'll be experienced. Masei der kishur mitzad kedushasam b'toiro mitzvahs. On the other hand, this that you're not connecting to Hashem through fulfilling Torah mitzvahs is doch das a meile ba'atzma ugluya. So this is a meile that there is in Yidden themselves, and it's revealed. When a Yid does a mitzvah, he's fulfilling Hashem's Torah. He has Hashem's chachma in his mind. There's the kedusha of Hashem that's revealed in him. Das alein is elikos ubegaloi. So you have godliness in the Yid, and it's revealed in him. Ubemeile, so there's a tremendous advantage to this, that this is a meile that's in the entity of the Yid himself, and it's revealed in him. Durch die Iskashus, Torah mitzvahs, when a Yid connects to Hashem through Torah mitzvahs, wird durch dem euch nisgale der tiefere Verbund von Yidden mit dem Neubestehen, die Iskashus mitzad Bechira. Once a Yid reveals his connection to Hashem in a revealed way, and it expressed, and he could sense it, the Maila that's in him, this also then actually triggers and reveals the true Maila of Yidden, which is the fact that they're essentially connected to Hashem even deeper than the Kedusha of Torah mitzvahs, but they're directly connected to Hashem through Bechira. The Bechira itself is no Maila that expresses the Yidden's Maila that they have. It's Hashem choosing them. Once the Yidden work on revealing their Maila that they have in their connection, that they could experience to Hashem, in their connection to Hashem, this also then reveals the true Maila, the Bechira that they have. Was Lefi says, move on. According to this, we can understand was medarf onkommen to them was Yisrael miskashram by Raisa b'Kodesh B'richu. So this explains why it's even necessary to have this connection to Hashem through Torah, and not just rely on the direct connection of Yid to Hashem. Chach, Yidden sind verbunden mit der Lekus, allein mitzad b'chirasi yisbarach, even though Yidden are really directly connected because of Hashem's choice. But yet we know, of course, that it's critical for a Yid to have this connection through Torah. And in the language of the Zohar, it seems to indicate that the connection of a Yid is only through Torah. Nor, das ist der Fall, but the reason is, weil der Gilui in Ichud von Bechira bei Yidden kommt durch ein Kisher mit der Reise. Because the only way to really reveal this Bechira, this special choice that Hashem chose a Yid, that you should see that there's something unique about a Yid that's different than everybody else, where do you see this? When a Yid fulfills Torah and mitzvahs. So when a Yid fulfills Torah mitzvahs, it's not only that now there's a special Kedusha that is revealing in him, but now you look at a Yid and you say, oh, look how special this Yid is. He's different than everybody else. That's the Bechira. Through Torah, you'll also be able to reveal the Bechira. But if you don't have Torah, not only are you lacking in the Kedusha on that aspect of the connection, but actually even the Bechira of the Eibusher Yid will also be completely concealed of you. So this explains, going back to what it said before regarding Eretz Yisrael as well. When Hashem chooses Eretz Yisrael, but then there's the Torah and the mitzvahs that we do in Eretz Yisrael, and specifically the mitzvahs Hatluyas Ba'aretz. So by doing those mitzvahs, it also further reveals the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. So now, coming back over here to what the Rambam says regarding the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. Apizeh is muvan oich b'negeya le'Eretz Yisrael. Afal pi, so the Rabbi begins with the point that I just said, and then he comes back to the Rambam. Afal pi as Bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu is an inyan nitzchi, was das wert dem Ohos von dem Davar HaNifcha. Even though when Hashem chooses Eretz Yisrael, so this is something which is eternal. And this becomes the very essence of what this chosen item is, and in this case, the territory of Eretz Yisrael. Von deswegen, nevertheless, wie bald es kommt mitzad Bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, since it's Hashem's choice, and there's nothing that there is in the mitzias of the land itself that's causing this. Is der Gilui davon, the revelation of this choice of Hashem, verbunden mit der Kedusha bepayel, was is da in Eretz Yisrael, will only be revealed through the actual Kedusha that there is through the Yidden that are there doing Torah mitzvahs there. So now this brings us back to a unique thing that we see in the Rambam, going back to something that the Rebbe pointed out before, that when the Rambam speaks about Eretz Yisrael, he speaks about two aspects, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and also the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. But the interesting thing that we saw before was, even when the Rambam brings up the subject of the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael in a separate halacha and halacha Yud Beis, he sort of brings together, he joins together the Bechira of Eretz Yisrael with the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, seemingly, if an halacha Yud Beis, the Rambam wants to add a new point, that there's a Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, so why, in the same halacha, does the Rambam bring different psukim and different expressions where he includes together the Kedusha along with the Bechira of Hashem? But based on what we learned here, it's very understood. Das is the time. This explains why was b'shas the Rambam read wegen dem Isi Yitziyah Eretz Yisrael v'chayetze bezeh. When the Rambam speaks about the Isser of not leaving Eretz Yisrael, teilt er nicht voneinander befeirisch zwischen die zwei Meiles Bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu und Kedushasa. The Rambam never clearly separates these two aspects. This whole Chiddush of the Sikha, or one of the Chiddushim here in the Sikha, that in Eretz Yisrael there are the two aspects that we see in the words of the Rambam, Kedusha and Bechira. The Rambam doesn't explicitly separate that there are two completely different things, Kedusha and Bechira, and he actually even brings it together. As das Madgish blois when I read Legabe Isi Yitziyah Mi Bavel Kanal. The only place where the Rambam clearly separates the Bechira from the Kedusha is when he's bringing Eretz Yisrael in connection to Bavel. Because by Bavel there's only the Bechira, so there the Rambam just brings the union of Bechira. But regarding Eretz Yisrael, the Rambam brings the Kedusha and the Bechira together. Why? Warum euch Meilas HaBechira is verbunden b'nigeyet zu ihr Gilui mit Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. Because even when we speak about the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, but how do you reveal the Bechira? Not only how do you reveal a different aspect of connection, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, but even the Bechira, in order to reveal the Bechira of Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, it's through the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. That also triggers to reveal the Bechira. So therefore, the Rambam brings these 2 points together. The Tachlis, Hashleimus Bezeh, the ultimate perfection or the ultimate level that will be revealed in this, that Zayin Lasad Lavai, will be in the time to come. Vas Bekarev Mamish, Yavoyu Yisrael, Yidden will come, Shenikru Nachla, Yidden are Hashem's inheritance. In other words, that Hashem chose them. La'eretz Shenikras Nachla, they'll come to the land that Hashem chose, that is Hashem's inheritance. V'yivnu Beis HaMikdash, Shenikra Nachla, and they'll build a Beis HaMikdash, it's also Hashem's inheritance. B'schus HaTeireh, in the merit of the Teireh that they learn, Shenikras Nachla, that's also Hashem's inheritance.